The sun was beginning to dip behind the towering palm trees surrounding the stadium at Indian Wells, casting a warm golden hue over the tennis courts. The atmosphere was electric, filled with the buzz of eager spectators awaiting what promised to be an exciting match between two rising stars of the tennis world, Carlos Alcaraz and Denis Shapovalov. The men's singles tournament at the BNP Paribas Open had already delivered its fair share of drama, but this match was something special. The young Spaniard, who had quickly established himself as one of the most exciting talents in tennis, was set to face the flamboyant and powerful Shapovalov, whose unorthodox style and explosive game had made him a crowd favorite. The tension in the air was palpable as the two players stood across from each other on the court for their warm-up. Alcaraz, wearing his usual calm and collected expression, casually bounced the ball while Shapovalov, more animated, was stretching his legs and adjusting his racket. As they exchanged brief glances, there was a sense of mutual respect between the two. Alcaraz, at just 19, had already achieved more than many seasoned players could dream of, winning his first Grand Slam, becoming the youngest world number one in tennis history, and making a mark on every surface he played on. Shapovalov, on the other hand, was known for his explosive game and never-say-die attitude, though his results had been somewhat inconsistent. He had the potential to become one of the best but was still looking to solidify his place among the sport's elite. The match began, and from the very first point, it was clear that both players were eager to make their mark. Shapovalov came out swinging, serving powerfully and hitting with his trademark aggression, while Alcaraz responded with his usual blend of speed, precision, and adaptability. The early exchanges were thrilling, with both men showing off their impressive array of shots, Alcaraz with his effortless movement and one-handed backhand, Shapovalov with his big forehand and fearless approach to the net. But as the first set unfolded, it became apparent that Alcaraz was in control. The Spaniard's ability to dictate the rallies, consistently finding the right balance between aggression and patience, left Shapovalov struggling to keep up. The young Canadian, known for his fiery temper and occasional lapses in concentration, seemed a step behind, unable to counter Alcaraz's precise shot-making. Every time Shapovalov would hit a big serve or a winner, Alcaraz would respond with a counterpunch, sliding across the court with ease, making even the most difficult shots look effortless. Despite Shapovalov's powerful game, it was clear that Alcaraz had the upper hand. His defensive skills were exceptional, turning what appeared to be a winning shot from Shapovalov into a neutral rally, and then taking charge when the opportunity arose. The first set was quickly wrapped up by Alcaraz, 6-3, and while Shapovalov had moments of brilliance, he seemed to lack the consistency required to challenge the Spaniard. As the second set began, Shapovalov came out with more fire in his belly, visibly frustrated by his performance in the first set. He was hitting harder, moving more aggressively, and trying to assert himself in the rallies. But Alcaraz, ever the tactician, was unflappable. With every misstep from Shapovalov, Alcaraz would calmly step in and put the pressure back on. His ability to read the game and make adjustments on the fly was one of the reasons why he had been able to reach such great heights in his young career. At one point, during a particularly long rally, Shapovalov attempted a stunning drop shot, trying to catch Alcaraz off guard. But Alcaraz, who had already begun to anticipate Shapovalov's movements, sprinted forward and dispatched a forehand winner down the line, much to the delight of the crowd. The reaction from the audience was a mixture of admiration and awe at how effortlessly the Spaniard had responded to what could have been a potential turning point in the match. Shapovalov, visibly deflated by this point, started to show signs of frustration. His normally explosive game began to lose its edge as unforced errors started to pile up. Alcaraz, on the other hand, remained cool and composed, playing with a level of maturity beyond his years. The contrast between the two players' mentalities was striking. While Shapovalov's raw talent and physicality were clear for all to see, it was Alcaraz's mental toughness and maturity that truly set him apart. By the time the match reached its climax, it was clear that Alcaraz had mastered the encounter. The Spaniard had already broken Shapovalov's serve twice in the second set and was serving for the match at 5-2. The crowd, sensing the end was near, began to rise to their feet, eagerly awaiting the final moments of this highly anticipated contest. With the first match point in play, Alcaraz calmly served, keeping his focus entirely on the task at hand. Shapovalov, despite his best efforts, was unable to return the serve with the same depth and power he had earlier in the match. The ball sailed long, and Alcaraz had secured the win, 6-3, 6-2. As he raised his arms in victory, the crowd erupted into applause. Alcaraz had delivered a flawless performance, showcasing not only his incredible skill but also his remarkable mental fortitude. He had never allowed Shapovalov to get into the match, and in the end, it was a testament to his discipline and professionalism that had seen him through. But the real moment that would make headlines came after the match. As the players shook hands at the net, Alcaraz couldn't help but let out a playful smirk. Shapovalov, who had been visibly disappointed with his performance, was walking off the court with his head down. As the two passed each other, Alcaraz, perhaps sensing a moment of lightheartedness, couldn't resist. With a grin on his face, Alcaraz turned to Shapovalov and, in a lighthearted and teasing manner, whispered something that only the Canadian could hear. The words were inaudible to the crowd, but the mischievous twinkle in Alcaraz's eyes was enough to let everyone know that he had just pulled off a cheeky remark. Shapovalov, who had a history of being emotional on court, couldn't help but crack a smile despite himself. The moment was brief, but it was a snapshot of Alcaraz's confidence and the playful nature that made him so likable to fans around the world. For Alcaraz, it was just another victory in what was quickly becoming an extraordinary career. He had won with style, grace, and the kind of swagger that suggested he was not just the future of tennis but also a player who thrived under pressure. He had outclassed Shapovalov on the court, and now, in a moment of jest, he had managed to get under the Canadian's skin as well, albeit in a fun and light-hearted manner. The media, as expected, quickly picked up on the exchange. Headlines flashed across screens, with many highlighting Alcaraz's playful jab at Shapovalov after the match. Some fans and commentators would label it as unsporting, but most saw it for what it truly was, a light-hearted moment between two young athletes who, despite their fierce competitive spirit, still maintained a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect. As for Shapovalov, he took the defeat in stride. While it was undoubtedly a tough loss for him, he knew he had been outplayed by one of the most talented players of his generation. He would surely learn from the experience and come back stronger. In interviews after the match, Shapovalov was quick to praise Alcaraz's performance, acknowledging that the Spaniard had been in a class of his own that day. He also took the playful exchange in good spirits, joking that Alcaraz had caught him off guard with his comments. For Alcaraz, the victory at Indian Wells was just another step in his meteoric rise to the top of the tennis world. With each win, he continued to prove that he was more than just a flash in the pan, that he had the consistency, mental strength, and maturity to back up his prodigious talent. And as for the playful jab at Shapovalov, it was just another indication that the young Spaniard was not only a fierce competitor on the court but also someone who enjoyed the game and had fun with it. As the tournament moved forward, Alcaraz's confidence was on full display. He would go on to make a deep run, and the tennis world would continue to watch in awe as this young prodigy continued to make history. But the match against Shapovalov at Indian Wells would always stand out, not just for the high level of tennis on display, but for the playful moment between two competitors, one that perfectly encapsulated the spirit of the game. The tension between the two players on the court seemed to grow with every point, a palpable energy that seemed to grip not only the players but also the fans. The crowd was completely captivated by the unfolding drama, caught up in the ebb and flow of the match. Carlos Alcaraz's composed demeanor contrasted sharply with the intensity of Denis Shapovalov's aggressive, almost reckless play. The match was a battle not only of physical prowess but of mental strength, with Alcaraz's poise under pressure becoming more evident as each game passed. Alcaraz's footwork was immaculate, almost as if he was gliding across the court, while Shapovalov, despite his incredible power and athleticism, seemed to be a step behind. Each time Shapovalov tried to unleash one of his trademark winners, Alcaraz would somehow manage to turn the tide, reaching balls that seemed unreturnable and responding with his own shots that were both precise and lethal. His movement was so fluid that it almost seemed like he was reading Shapovalov's every move, anticipating his next stroke before the Canadian even made it. The crowd, recognizing the spectacle of Alcaraz's game, began to cheer him on with growing fervor. It was evident that the young Spaniard was not just playing well, he was playing with an elegance and confidence that only the very best players possessed. His composure under pressure, the way he would calmly wipe the sweat from his brow, nodding to himself as if reaffirming his own focus, made it clear that he was not just participating in the match, but in complete control of it. His awareness of the situation was uncanny, as if he had an innate understanding of how to manage every aspect of his game, no matter what Shapovalov threw at him. Shapovalov, on the other hand, seemed to struggle with the enormity of the challenge. His frustration was building, visible in the way he would mutter to himself after each lost point, his racket sometimes slapping the ground in frustration. Despite his talent, there was an evident disparity between his fiery energy and Alcaraz's calculated demeanor. Shapovalov was known for his flashes of brilliance, but it was often the inconsistency of his game that let him down. Against a player like Alcaraz, whose consistency and mental fortitude were rapidly becoming his defining traits, this inconsistency was proving to be a major hindrance. In the third game of the second set, Shapovalov had a chance to break Alcaraz's serve. He had managed to get to 30-30, but instead of closing the gap, he hit a wild forehand wide, sending the ball sailing into the stands. The mistake was telling. Shapovalov slammed his racket against the ground in frustration, and the sound echoed across the stadium. His shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of the match seemingly beginning to take its toll on him. Alcaraz, however, remained calm and collected. He gave a small nod, as if to say, "I expected that," and stepped back to serve again. His serve was sharp and precise, right to the corner, and Shapovalov could only manage a weak return. With a few well-placed strokes, Alcaraz had won the game, and Shapovalov's chances of breaking were gone. As the Spaniard stood tall at the baseline, he exuded a quiet confidence that could not be ignored. Even in the most intense moments, he maintained a sense of serenity, a reminder that he had the mental discipline to complement his physical abilities. The tension between the two continued to build, but the match was also becoming a study in contrasting playing styles. Shapovalov's approach was brash and bold, always looking to hit winners or go for the spectacular shot. He would race to the net after blasting a forehand, trying to pressure Alcaraz into making a mistake. But Alcaraz's ability to defend, to turn defense into offense, was on full display. He made Shapovalov's powerful shots look like mere setups for his own counters, neutralizing the Canadian's attempts to take charge of the rallies. Each time Shapovalov looked like he might seize control, Alcaraz would find a way to claw back into the point, making it look like he had all the time in the world. It was a contrast of personalities as much as it was a contrast of styles. Shapovalov's intensity was visible in the way he'd slam his racket against the ground, mutter under his breath, or talk to himself between points. His emotions were right there on his sleeve, for all to see. Alcaraz, in contrast, was the epitome of composure. He would occasionally glance at his box, where his team sat, but otherwise, he remained entirely focused on the task at hand, making calculated decisions with every stroke. It was clear that for Alcaraz, tennis was a game of precision, a mental chess match as much as it was a physical contest. Shapovalov, though undeniably talented, seemed to be playing more on instinct, relying on his power and athleticism to carry him through the match. With each passing game, it became more evident that Alcaraz had a clear plan, while Shapovalov's strategy seemed to be unraveling. The Spanish teenager wasn't simply responding to the ball, he was dictating the terms of the match. He would send Shapovalov to the corners, make him work tirelessly to cover the court, then pick his moment to strike, always staying one step ahead. When Shapovalov attempted to close the gap by rushing the net, Alcaraz would calmly lob the ball over his head, forcing him to scramble. The Canadian's frustration was mounting, and with every lost point, Alcaraz seemed to grow more and more comfortable in his skin, as if this was just another practice session, another opportunity to hone his skills. The match, which had started with such promise for Shapovalov, was slipping away from him. The Canadian serve, which had been a weapon in the past, was now being neutralized by Alcaraz's returns. The young Spaniard would stand tall at the baseline, watching Shapovalov's serve, then simply step forward and return it with incredible precision, often placing the ball in a spot that Shapovalov could not reach in time. Each return was calculated, a reminder of the Spaniard's exceptional court sense. There was a specific moment in the second set that encapsulated the difference in their approaches. Shapovalov, with his back against the wall, hit a blistering forehand down the line, a shot that seemed destined to give him a vital break point. But Alcaraz, without hesitation, tracked the ball down, slid across the court, and with a flick of his wrist, returned the shot with ease. It wasn't a flashy shot, but it was perfect placement, right into the open space. Shapovalov's head dropped as he watched the ball sail past him for a winner, and the collective sigh of the crowd made it clear that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Shapovalov, his energy drained, tried to rally, but the weight of the match seemed to be too much for him to handle. As he sat in his chair between games, he took deep breaths, trying to reset his mind. His coach, visibly concerned, offered a few words of encouragement, but Shapovalov's frustration was hard to ignore. He was known for his fiery personality, but there was a certain edge to his anger now, an acknowledgement that, despite all of his effort, Alcaraz had simply outplayed him. On the other side of the net, Alcaraz was unfazed. He sat in his chair with the same serene look, sipping his water, his face unreadable as always. He was a young player, yet there was a quiet maturity about him that seemed almost unnatural. He wasn't celebrating the victories in the same way Shapovalov was letting his emotions spill over. Instead, he was simply focused on the next point, the next game, the next opportunity to prove that he was the better player on that day. As the match continued, Alcaraz's mastery over the court became more and more evident. It was no longer just about winning points. It was about controlling the narrative, dictating the pace of the game. Shapovalov, for all his power and aggression, was no match for Alcaraz's intelligence and versatility. Every time the Canadian tried to change the course of the match, Alcaraz would calmly adjust and reassert control. The energy from the crowd was building, growing ever more appreciative of the young Spaniard's talent. The atmosphere in the stadium had shifted from one of anticipation to one of admiration. It was as if the crowd was watching not just a match, but the emergence of a new tennis superstar, a player who was not only capable of winning but of dominating, and doing so with a sense of ease that belied his years. The match unfolded with an ever-growing tension, as every aspect of Alcaraz's game seemed to make a statement. His forehand, though not as powerful as Shapovalov's, was incredibly precise. The way he shaped his shots, creating angles that seemed impossible to hit, was a key factor in his dominance. Alcaraz had this uncanny ability to make his opponent feel like they were running in circles, trying to cover every inch of the court while he dictated the play. It was as though Alcaraz was sculpting the rallies, crafting each shot with the precision of an artist. Shapovalov, meanwhile, was no slouch. His forehand could still hit with blistering speed and force, but the problem was that his shots often lacked the depth and consistency required to break through Alcaraz's wall of defense. Shapovalov would hit a powerful shot, but Alcaraz would find a way to not only return it, but return it in a way that made the Canadian work twice as hard for the next point. He had an innate sense of timing, knowing when to step into the court and when to hang back and let Shapovalov's mistakes come to him. The crowd was caught up in every moment. At times, they would collectively gasp in awe when Alcaraz produced a miraculous shot from what seemed like an impossible position. One such moment came when Shapovalov, having lunged forward to intercept a deep shot from Alcaraz, was sure that the point was his. The Canadian stepped in, preparing to put the ball away with a sharp, angled volley, but Alcaraz, with his exceptional movement, slid just enough to reach the ball. He then executed a drop shot that skimmed just over the net, impossible for Shapovalov to catch in time. The crowd roared with approval, appreciating not just the shot, but the audacity and skill required to pull it off. The physicality of the match was evident in how much both players were pushing themselves. Sweat glistened on their foreheads, and their breathing was audible even from the stands. But while Shapovalov appeared to be expending most of his energy just to stay in the rallies, Alcaraz looked almost effortless in his movement. His footwork was exceptional. He was always in the right place at the right time. Even when a rally stretched to extreme lengths, Alcaraz was able to recover and reset his position with a fluidity that gave the impression he wasn't breaking a sweat, even when he was clearly working just as hard. Shapovalov's frustration was growing with every passing game. He began to take more risks, hitting his shots harder, trying to force Alcaraz into an error, but it was clear that he wasn't able to break the Spaniard's rhythm. At times, the Canadian would try to speed up the play by rushing the net after a big serve or a well-struck ground stroke. But Alcaraz had already anticipated this. His response was always measured, whether it was a well-placed passing shot or a perfectly timed lob that sent Shapovalov scrambling backwards, his head turning to watch as the ball sailed just out of reach. Alcaraz's ability to adjust mid-rally was another aspect of his game that stood out. There were moments when it appeared that Shapovalov had him on the ropes, pushing him wide with deep forehands or making him chase balls toward the sidelines. But every time Shapovalov thought he had an opening, Alcaraz would take the rally in a completely different direction, changing the pace or angle of his shots to regain control. It wasn't just about executing shots with power, it was about executing them with purpose. One of the most striking elements of Alcaraz's game was how he seemed to anticipate Shapovalov's every move. It wasn't as if he had read the Canadian's mind, rather, it was a result of his impeccable court sense and reading of the game. He seemed to know when Shapovalov was about to pull the trigger on a big shot, and he would position himself perfectly to intercept it, often turning what looked like a potential winner into just another ball for him to return. Even more fascinating was the way Alcaraz managed to control the tempo of the match. He would vary the speed of his shots, sometimes playing at a faster pace and then suddenly slowing things down, taking a few extra seconds to collect himself, and forcing Shapovalov into an uncomfortable position where he couldn't find his rhythm. The way Alcaraz mixed up the pace, tempo, and direction of his shots kept Shapovalov guessing, never allowing him to settle into any kind of flow. The Canadian, despite his best efforts, seemed to be perpetually behind, always a step slower, a step further away from finding his mark. His movements became more frantic as the match wore on, his body language betraying his inner frustration. There was a look of disbelief on his face after every missed opportunity. He would shake his head, mutter something under his breath, and try to reset himself, but it was clear that Alcaraz was controlling the match on all fronts. The moments of brilliance from Shapovalov, though few and far between, were still enough to remind the crowd of his undeniable talent. On one occasion, Shapovalov unleashed a fierce forehand down the line, sending Alcaraz scrambling across the court. With his back to the baseline, Alcaraz managed to track the ball down and send a backhand return deep into the corner. Shapovalov responded with a perfectly executed drop shot, catching Alcaraz off guard. But Alcaraz, never one to be easily caught, recovered quickly and chased down the drop shot, flicking a winner past Shapovalov with an almost casual flick of his wrist. The crowd erupted, appreciating the display of athleticism from both players, even as it became clear that Alcaraz was the one in control. The physical battle was exhausting. Both players were showing signs of fatigue, their legs heavy from the repeated sprints and their faces glistening with sweat. Yet, despite the physical toll, Alcaraz's mental strength remained unwavering. Even as the rallies grew longer and more demanding, he never seemed to lose focus or intensity. It was as if the pressure of the moment only fueled his determination. Meanwhile, Shapovalov's frustration reached a breaking point during one of the longer rallies. After another missed opportunity, this time, a long forehand that sailed just wide, he slammed his racket into the ground with a loud thwack. It was a raw display of emotion, a sharp contrast to Alcaraz's calm. The Spaniard, however, did not respond to the outburst with any kind of gloating or trash talk. Instead, he simply nodded to himself, his face unchanged, as if to say, "I'm just doing my job." The contrast between the two was striking, Shapovalov's fiery emotions, so raw and visible, and Alcaraz's quiet determination, a constant force that refused to be rattled. Even when Shapovalov would attempt to speed up the game, hitting faster and harder, Alcaraz would absorb the pressure and wait for the perfect moment to turn the match back in his favor. There was no panic in his game. He played each point with a calm assurance that seemed to grow stronger as the match went on. The longer the rallies, the more confident he seemed, knowing that eventually, Shapovalov's frustration would mount to the point where mistakes would be made. In the rare moments when Shapovalov would land a winning shot, such as a ferocious serve or a perfectly executed volley, Alcaraz never reacted with surprise or frustration. Instead, he would simply acknowledge the point with a small nod, as though to say, "Well played," and then get ready for the next one. His focus was unwavering. Alcaraz was not concerned with the occasional brilliance from his opponent. He was playing the long game, knowing that consistency and patience would eventually win the day. The crowd continued to watch, entranced by the unfolding spectacle. Each point seemed to take on greater significance as the match wore on. The audience could sense the tension between the two players, but they could also feel the growing admiration for Alcaraz's game. Every shot, every rally, was a testament to his unshakable belief in his abilities. It was a masterclass in composure, skill, and focus,